Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to give you an overview of V by Tony Harrison. We will be dipping into some analysis. Now, because the poem is so long, it's over 400 lines long, we're not going to be able to analyse every single sentence, every single line. So what I have done is pick out the key lines in the poem, particularly those that relate to the A-level AQA course, which is all about protest. So we will be focusing in on that particular idea. Now, as you're watching this video, either annotate your copy of the poem or make some Cornell notes like we did in the last video, and you've got a template there on the screen. But probably best to have a copy of the poem in front of you. I will be telling you which line numbers I'm talking about and annotate it as you listen. So before we get into it, quick knowledge check. Hopefully you've watched the previous video that I've made on this poem. What I'd like you to do is stop the video, answer the questions, and then start the video again when you are ready. Welcome back. Right, first of all, Elegy then is a poem that is a lament for the dead. It's written in honour of someone who has passed away. V is an elegy in the sense that it starts in a graveyard, and Harrison is considering the graves of his family and the community, those who have contributed to making him as a poet and who have passed away. Second one, iconoclastic, is where you're destroying tradition. And so one of the things that we know Harrison does in his poems is destroy the traditions of what came before. So one of the key traditions that he's trying to destroy or challenge or subvert is that of poetry. And we see that in his sonnets, which don't quite fit the traditional expected structure of the sonnet. They have some extra lines in there. We see that the content of his sonnets is quite surprising. They're not about romantic love, they're about love for his community. They're often quite angry and frustrated. And we also see his iconoclastic attitude in terms of the colloquial language and the profanities that he includes in his poetry. Pastoral is poetry that is to do with nature, normally celebrating the innocence and the perfection of the natural world. It often looks back to childhood or to an idealised time in the past, before industry, before the cities corrupted things. V could stand for lots of things. So number 4 could be verses, could be the V with the slit down the middle, which is sexist graffiti, which is referred to in the poem. It could be victory, or if you flip your fingers round, it could be a rude gesture. Number 5 then, so the context of the poem's composition. Well, it was written in 1984 to 1985, which was during the miners' strikes, Thatcher versus the National Union of Miners. Thatcher wanted to kind of reorganise the mining system because it wasn't profitable, and the miners wanted to keep all the mines open and to keep everyone's jobs and secure good pay for the miners and good conditions for the miners. It was then recorded and performed for Channel 4 in 1987. And at that point, there was a huge furore about the screening of that poem on TV because of the sheer volume of swear words that are in this poem. There is also racist language in this poem. Now, those words, the swear words and the racist language, are graffitied on the tombstones in the graveyard that Harrison is describing. And he's trying to reflect the anger, the frustration, and also some of the prejudices of skinhead culture. Yeah, we'll get into that when we talk about the poem a bit more. The two characters who argue in the poem. So again, we're going to look at this again in this video. We have Harrison, the educated middle-class poet who has left his working class origins behind and has, through his grammar school education, through his university education, kind of distanced himself from those working class roots. And then the alter ego, who's almost the person that Harrison might have been had he not gone to grammar school. He's an angry, unemployed, skinhead who is frustrated with the government and frustrated with the educated Tony Harrison as well. And let's get into the poem then. So it starts with a dedication. My father still reads the dictionary every day. He says your life depends on your power to master words. Now, this is a quotation from Arthur Scargill, who was the leader of the National Union of Miners, or the NUM. And this dedication really celebrates the power of language, which is quite a common theme on this A-level course. We see it in The Kite Runner, we see it in A Doll's House as well, and in the other protest texts. So this is about how, if you're able to manipulate language, to use language to persuade other people of your point of view, then you can take control of a situation. Then, as the poem itself begins, we have direct address at the opening. Tony Harrison is directly engaging with his readers, with his audience. Remember, this is a poem that's supposed to be performed. You can have a look at the video on Channel 4, which is now on YouTube. And the televised version of this poem shows Tony Harrison in a boiler suit, as in a nod to his working class origins, addressing a live audience. And so it's supposed to be a poem that communicates directly and immediately to the listener. And that's reflected in the direct address in the opening lines. He then looks around the graveyard and looks at the graves of the butcher, the publican, and the baker. So three kind of skilled working class jobs that produce products that people would need to survive. So the kind of bread and butter, literally, of human society. And alongside that, he imagines his own grave with the word bard chiselled into the gravestone. Now, there's quite a lot of things going on here. If you've read Marked with B, you will know that in that poem, Harrison is thinking about how people are labelled as their jobs, kind of that employment becomes their identity in our modern society, and that actually can be quite reductive, especially if someone's job is looked down on for whatever reason. But here he's almost celebrating these three kind of types of employment that do form the basis of our society and that are skilled jobs and that should be respected. If you think of working, it's the same kind of thing. He's trying to dignify the working classes here, and he sees himself as part of this culture. So the word bard, you might know it because Shakespeare is often referred to as the bard. Bard means poet or writer, and he chooses this quite monosyllabic Anglo-Saxon word, I think because it sounds quite similar to the others. Look at that plosive, that B sound, butcher, baker, bard. It alliterates with those other words and therefore sits quite nicely alongside it. If you've read other poems by Harrison, you'll know that Harrison's really self-conscious because he thinks that he is different. His grammar school education, his university education has removed him from his working class roots. And one of the things he's trying to do here is put himself back into that kind of working class culture and argue that his job is just as valuable. Whereas his dad produced bread, Harrison produces poems. It's another product which is essential to modern life. He talks about Byron and Wordsworth. Now, this is supposed to be quite funny because we anticipate that Byron and Wordsworth are going to be the great poets. Actually, they are not. Again, they are skilled workers who have created products for the modern world. So there's a bit of humour there in terms of how Harrison undercuts our expectations. And again, he's playing with that idea of the bard, you know, the bard being the poet. Well, Byron and Wordsworth are poets normally, but in this context, Byron and Wordsworth are skilled workers, and therefore Harrison again is trying to diminish, to reduce the distance between what we expect from working class employees and what we expect from the poet. He's trying to align those two things and say, actually, poets aren't quite so different from skilled workers. He also talks about the mines that go underneath the graveyard, and he's kind of imagines the graveyard falling down into the mine shafts. So quite interesting, because I suppose one of the things that he's saying is how the mines have kind of destroyed the natural environment and might cause everything to collapse into them. Or he could be saying that actually the foundations of this society, you know, the foundation is on mining, the importance of the mining to the community living in the north. Moving on to lines 25 to 28 then. Harrison talks about his grammar school education, where he learned Latin and Greek, and then I've put the V there for versus the football fans who are graffitiing their profanities on the gravestones. So he juxtaposes these two experiences, and there's a link if you want to make it to divisions, where there's kind of profanities and so on as well, and the football fans are tattooing their bodies with various different things. I think the link there is quite clear. Between lines 25 and 54 then, Harrison is an iconoclast. And remember, iconoclast is about destroying traditions. And his iconoclastic approach to poetry includes challenging what is acceptable in terms of poetic voice and poetic vocabulary. So if you've studied the GCSE anthology for HEA, you will know there's lots of nature, there's lots of kind of love in there, there's lots of really beautiful imagery. If you're doing Keats as part of your A-level, again, the imagery is really luscious and rich, and there's a particular kind of language that we expect from poetry. What we don't expect is what he does in Divisions, which is talk about hemorrhoids and use swear words, and he repeats those profanities in V, which is why it caused such a furore when it was televised on Channel 4. So here, what Harrison is doing is iconoclastically trying to challenge what we expect from poetry and to say, actually, I'm writing a new poetry. I'm the voice of the working classes here, and I'm going to kind of undermine, subvert everything that you expect from poetic language. He then reflects on skinhead culture a little bit further. He talks about the alcoholism, the graffiti, the anger. Now, obviously, this is all kind of very stereotyped, very sweeping statements. We could challenge this in lots of ways, but this is how Harrison portrays the skinheads in his poem. And one of the main ideas in the poem is that the skinhead characters are so angry because they have been let down by the government. We see this idea in Divisions as well. We see it to a lesser extent in Marked with D, but it is definitely there. The sense that England, in that poem, has let his father down, hasn't given him an education. We see it in Working because the working class character is trapped by a system that she cannot change. We see it in National Trust again, where the convict is trapped by the system. So this huge kind of outpouring of anger that we see in Harrison's poems comes through in V as well. And here it's directed at the education system, and it talks about the tick they never marked his work with much at school. So here's another meaning of the letter V. As well as being versus and victory and all of that, it could be the shape of a tick. But really sadly for these characters, they haven't succeeded in the mainstream education system, and that kind of being let down by the education system has led them, at least partly, into this situation of unemployment and into this situation of being incredibly angry. Moving on in the poem then, lines 70 to 85, the main theme here is versus, and Harrison lists lots of binary opposites he sees in society. Now, when we say binary, we mean two very different things. So, for example, left versus right. And Harrison sees these binaries in very black and white terms, male versus female. He doesn't, at this point in the poem, consider that there might be any grey areas in between. But here he essentially lists all the different divisions in society, the different opposites who are coming into conflict. I'm not going to look at every single section of the poem, so I'm going to jump ahead a bit to line 126. And here he describes his pen as being a magic wand. Now, this is back to the idea of language being power, of the written word being a really kind of strong protest against injustices that are happening. We know that Harrison sees the purpose of his poetry as being to give a voice to the voiceless working classes. And here he juxtaposes his pen with the graffiti that the skinheads are able to write. And actually, those two things are very different. The poem is very different from the graffiti, so they are juxtaposed. But also, they're quite similar, at least Harrison sees them as being quite similar. Harrison talks about using his pen to make a frustrated protest about the treatment of the working classes. And that's pretty much the same thing as the skinheads are doing when they graffiti the gravestones. Their act of graffitiing is a frustrated protest against the situation that they find themselves in, just like Harrison's poem, is a frustrated protest about the situation that the skinheads find themselves in. So whilst the magic wand, the pen, is very different from the graffiti, actually Harrison is trying to draw a similarity between them. Okay, but we have a problem. And at this point in the poem, line 169, the alter ego comes in. Now, if you've watched the previous video in this series, you'll know that Harrison's educated persona is the main character in the poem. And then when we move into italics, we have a skinhead alter ego. And this is the kind of what if character. What would have happened to Harrison if he hadn't gone to grammar school, if he hadn't gone to university? So we've got a kind of split personality here, or the id and the ego, if you want to think about it in Freudian terms. Now, until this point, Harrison has been trying to place himself alongside all of the different types of employment in the working classes. He had the butcher, the publican, the baker, and the bard, as if being a poet is part of that group, as if it's the same kind of thing. He talks about his pen being a magic wand, giving voice to the voiceless, voicing the frustrations of the working classes. So he very much tries to put himself in the position of a working class poet. And when the skinhead comes in, what the skinhead says is, actually, that's not right. That's not possible. You're not working class anymore. You don't have our lived experience anymore. And actually, your poetry is really pretentious. And basically, you're pretty arrogant. So the educated persona enters into this argument with the skinhead. And this argument is triggered by the phrase cri de coeur. So the educated persona says, is this graffiti a cri de coeur, which is French for a cry of the heart? Is this graffiti actually an expression of existential angst? Is it the pain and the suffering, rather than just being a kind of mindlessly graffitied swear word on a tombstone? Is this actually a sign of a huge amount of kind of sensitivity and anger and pain that lies underneath that macho facade? So Harrison says, right, is this graffiti a cri de coeur? And the skinhead alter ego comes in and says, what's a cri de coeur? And he really highlights how actually Harrison isn't using the language of the working classes. We're talking stereotypically here. Harrison isn't speaking directly and immediately to the people that actually he's kind of putting himself alongside. And so what that alter ego is doing is it reveals Harrison's self-consciousness at the failure of his poetic mission. Because of his educational background, Harrison continually uses academic language, obscure references that aren't accessible to people who haven't been to grammar school. And we see that particularly in a poem called Them and Us, which has got Keats and Wordsworth and Demosthenes and all sorts of quite academic references in the poem. So actually what Harrison's thinking here is, as a poet who wants to speak for the working classes and speak to the working classes, I have failed completely. And the alter ego in line 176 has a really cutting line and says that your mother didn't understand your poetry. Your mother thought your poetry was obscene, which would be quite upsetting, I suppose, for Harrison to reflect on. As we progress then, the educated persona tries to defend himself, and he says, look, all I want is to speak for you. I want to give you a voice, and I want aspirations for you so that you can have a better future. And the skinhead mocks this concept of aspirations. He says, look, it's a load of rubbish. These are futile. The country is a place of high unemployment. We have no education. We have been let down by the government. So your kind of poetic attempt to give us aspirations, that is a total failure. And here we see kind of Harrison's despair, I suppose, at the purpose of his poetry. When we get to line 186 then onwards, the alter ego kind of turns and looks at the gravestones and sees, publican, butcher, baker engraved on the gravestones, and he expresses his fury at that. There's a couple of things going on here. So one is that people are defined by their employment. Someone is a butcher. Well, surely there's a lot else in that person's life than them being a butcher. They probably have family, they have interests, they have hobbies, etc. And then the alter ego also points out what's going to be written on my gravestone. Someone who's unemployed, someone who's on the dole, someone who's been let down by society and denied the opportunity to find employment. What's going to be on my gravestone? And again, we see that absolute fury come through at this point of the poem. Jumping on a bit then, so the alter ego then questions whether the educated Harrison is able to represent the working classes anymore. This stands as a really good section to look at in detail, especially if you're doing the AQA A-level in protest. This particular stanza would be one to kind of highlight and pick out. And the alter ego mocks the concept of poetry completely. He argues that this art form can't do anything to improve society. It is futile, it is a waste of time. So we're kind of building on that theme of Harrison's self-consciousness about the purpose, the usefulness of his poetic aims. Skipped quite a bit here, down to the end of the poem, because this video, I only want it to be so long. I don't want to go through the whole thing line by line. So looking at the final stanza then, the question to ask ourselves would be, is there a resolution to the conflict between the educated poet and the alter ego? Do they manage to find a way forward where Harrison can speak for the working classes through the medium of poetry? Well, Harrison imagines his gravestone after his death. And he considers the context that his poetry has developed within, his working class culture, the mining industry, and so on. Personally, I don't think that this final stanza lays to rest the conflict that we saw earlier in the poem. However, he's kind of looking at where he's come from, I suppose, and looking out from the hill as to where he's planning to head in the future. Okay, so the main things, I suppose, to take away from this particular poem are this kind of expression of really like kind of deeply felt anger at the situation that the 1980s government has left the North in, particularly the northern working classes. It's kind of talking to us about all of the different divisions within society that we see. And then it's talking about the divisions within Tony Harrison himself, the fact that he wants to speak for the working classes, but that at the same time he is not able to do so because he is no longer working class himself. Okay, thank you very much for watching. I hope you find this useful. I hope you annotated your poem as you were watching. Might be a good idea to go back and watch it again, just so that you can pick up on anything that you missed. Okay, thank you.